Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lunchtime session of CME Palooza Spring. Lunchtime, I guess, if you are on the East Coast. We're eating early. Let me bring up our slides here. Our lunchtime panel is sponsored by the wonderful people at Archimedics. Title of our session is Data-Driven and Agile Educational Design, Ensuring Your Courses Intelligently Evolve. And our moderator today is Brian McGowan. So in addition to Archimedics, who's one of the gold sponsors for CME Palooza Spring, also want to thank Intelligent Medical Decisions, the other gold sponsor, our silver sponsors, Genentech, iMedix, MedPage Today, and then our bronze sponsors as well, Advanced Studies in Medicine, Clinical Care Options, CME Matters, CMEology, CME Outfitters, Decision Simulation, Educational Measures, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, Highmark CE, Impact Education, Infograph Ed, Platform Q Health Education, and Vindico Medical Education. There are three ways that you can ask questions. The first one is you can use the MedPage Today text line to send in a question, 267-6660-CME. You can also click on the Google plus Q&A link, which is located at the bottom of each video. You should see a little link there. You do have to have a Google Plus account in order to do that. And then the third way is you can always tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. So any of those will work, and we will do our very best to get to as many of your questions as we can. Our speaker disclosure slide, as always, opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are their own and do not represent an endorsement by employer, parent company, or affiliates. And moving on to the panel, again, moderator is Brian McGowan, Chief Learning Officer and co-founder at Archimedics. Brian, at this point, I will turn things over to you and let you introduce the rest of your panel.
Thank you very much, Derek, and thanks to Scott. Speaking on behalf of my panelists, it's absolutely an honor to present this topic to the community. I think over the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes, you'll find hopefully some really important things that you can take away, things that may change the way you think about the development and the assessment of your educational programs. And hopefully, for a few folks out there, this is going to be a foundational presentation, one that really changes the expectation of what your educational design looks like. I'm joined today by two illustrious panelists, Griselda Butler, Manager of Professional Education at Otsuka, America Pharmaceutical Inc. She's joining us from Maryland, and Scott Weber, who is the CEO of MedIQ. And Scott, I believe you're joining us from Connecticut today. Is that true?
That's correct.
From a standing desk.
From a standing desk. They have those here.
Before we dig into the topic, I absolutely want to recognize Derek and Scott in their planning process for pairing our session immediately after Jason's session that just went before us. I've had the pleasure of working with Jason for the last couple years on and have learned a lot from him about how he views the rigor and the validity, the reliability of the types of assessment models that he employs. I think over this session with Scott and Griselda, you're going to find that the two presentations couple very nicely together. And I bring that up now because anyone who is viewing this in the archive anytime after April 8th, 2015, I highly recommend that maybe you push pause on the video, go back and find Jason's presentation on the secrets of outcomes revealed, and watch that session first, and then come back to this session, because as we describe this data-driven and agile educational design approach, I think you'll find that there's a lot of very, very practical tips that Jason's provided, which will perfectly support the story that we're going to tell. So as we start this session, as the moderator, I'm going to speak for probably 15 to 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. The panelists will join in from time to time if there are topics or items that they either want to dig more deeply into or have questions about. And as Derek mentioned, he'll be collecting questions through the helpline, through Twitter, through other channels. And then we're going to turn over the audio and video over to Scott, and Scott will present from his perspective some case studies of how his organization has succeeded with Agile educational design over the past few months, and Griselda comes to this presentation as a supporter, and hopefully we'll get some perspective from her on how Agile educational design may be perceived, the value of Agile educational design may be perceived by supporters. So that's our introduction. If we can move to the beginning, we're going to frame the conversation with a simple question. So Derek, if we could have the next slide. And this question hopefully serves as a foundation for everything that follows, and level sets a little bit for those who are joining this session. The question is framed at the bottom of the slide, and simply put, do you view educational planning as an endpoint, or do you view educational planning as a process? It's probably a good idea to just reflect on that question a little bit. So if we view educational planning as an endpoint, then we plan, we implement, and we launch educational programs, and then at some subsequent date, maybe months down the road, we measure the impact of it. If we view it as a process, then what we're trying to achieve is an iterative, adaptive approach where we launch education, and then in the days or weeks that follow, we listen attentively to understand the impact that that initial version of the educational intervention has. And then we subsequently interpret and finally adapt that program. And that iterative process may take weeks, it may take months, it may run the full life of the educational program. So keep that question in mind. I'm going to come at this question from a unique perspective, I think, and on the next slide I'll introduce a little bit of what I feel the value proposition of Agile educational design is. And the subject line, the title line of this slide may be provocative for some, but I believe that there's never been a perfect educational activity. That's not to say that the educational activities that our community builds aren't good, even great sometimes. But I also see, maybe through the lens of humility as an educational planner, that there's only so much data I have about the learners that I'm trying to educate. So I need to stay open to the idea that the educational program could evolve, it could be refined, it could be improved. Now, the lack of perfection in an educational activity, again, it's not a condemnation. And in fact, the challenges of the cognitive learning process, the intrinsic load of content, the extraneous load of the learning experience, or even the germane load, so how motivated or attentive is a learner, that is a very complex psychology of learning, one that I believe in almost every case we cannot perfectly crack from day one of the educational planning process. Now, coupled to that, the second point here, which is, given the complexity of instructional design options, structuring information, content presentation, the environment in which learning is being provided or is available, and a topic that I speak about quite frequently, which is this unevolved learning actions science that's evolving. It's hard to imagine that you're going to hit every one of those challenges, every one of those complexities, perfect from day one. And then the third point is, given the challenges of cognitive processing and given the challenges of educational interventions, we should accept that our activities will never be perfect out of the gate. Now, that recognition is really foundational for everything we're going to cover after this fact. If you believe that your educational programs are perfect out of the gate, then for those of you on the West Coast, I just gave you 15 minutes back. It's a perfect time for lunch. For those of on the East Coast, if you're on the West Coast, maybe it's a perfect time for breakfast. But for those of you who are willing to accept that your educational programs, our educational programs, could be improved and refined over time, then hopefully in the next few slides we can present a very practical approach for how we can do this and do it productively and do it efficiently. So with the next slide, Derek, what we're going to introduce and dive more deeply into is this concept of Agile educational design. For those who are unfamiliar with it, Agile educational design is really an umbrella term. It refers to the planning and the operational approach that view educational planning as an ongoing process, where the planning process, the interventions themselves, can be broken into smaller pieces that are more flexible and that are able to be refined as your data dictates. Now, the term Agile educational design may be new for some of those, some of you participating, but if we frame it relative to other ways that the concept has been approached, Derek, if we move on to the build here, many, in fact, we've heard it several times today, many of us are familiar with the PDSA cycle, the plan, do, study, act cycle. And usually when you see this planning loop illustration, this schematic, you'll see that there may be 4 or 5 versions of it in a row. So you plan, you do, you study, you change. You plan, you do, you study, you change. That PDSA cycle is one way of referring to or describing Agile educational design. Archimedics, the company that I founded 3 years ago and for whom I serve as the Chief Learning Officer, we've positioned this in a slightly different way, something we refer to as the Learning Actions Model, where the data that's collected is slightly more evolved than just traditional assessment data. It adds more data to the interpretation, to the analysis, and in the Learning Actions Model, it also provides the educators the ability to refine or adapt their educational content quite frequently and quite easily. Now, accepting that our programs may not be perfect from day one, but that we can evolve them adaptively over time so that they can get better and ultimately get closer and closer to reaching all the goals that we originally set out. It's really important, maybe the most important idea that we're going to review today is to list and then dig deeply into the 3 critical elements of Agile educational design. So the first critical element of Agile educational design is that you must be able to measure. And if you were able to listen to Jason's talk directly before this one, or if you're in the archives, if you can go to Jason's talk, he talks eloquently about the complexities of measuring, the limitations of measuring, and how to appropriately frame your measurement. The second critical element of Agile educational design is that you must be able to analyze the data that you have. Collecting mountains of data, but not necessarily having the competency or the resources to analyze or interpret that data isn't necessarily a path towards Agile educational design. You must be able to measure, and you must be able to analyze or interpret efficiently that data to understand what should be changed, what could be changed about the content or the learning experience. The number 3 critical element here is equally important. Having great data and having the resources and the ability to analyze that data to understand what could or should be changed is not sufficient to present an Agile educational plan if the content that you originally created is set in stone. If you don't have the ability to adapt your content efficiently, cost-effectively, and easily, then all the data and all the analysis in the world is just going to be a time sink if you don't have the ability to adapt your educational content. So what we're going to do in the next few slides is dig a little bit more deeply into each of the three critical elements, and that will eventually tee up Scott as he presents his case study, and he presents very practical examples of how these three critical elements were brought to bear on educational programs that he and his group have operationalized over the last few months. So in planned redundancy, we'll move to the next slide around measuring. But go ahead, Derek. Oh, do you want to interject?
No, sorry,
okay.
I had myself on mute because they're hammering again outside the door. I just want to remind everyone there are 3 different ways to ask their questions: texting, the Google Q&A app, and the CME Palooza hashtag. But we'll move on. Okay, thank you.
So the first of the critical elements that we'll dive more deeply into, and it would come to no surprise to those who've heard me speak before, I could probably speak for 3 hours just on this topic. And I'll say that 2 more times over the next 2 slides. But the first critical element is this idea that more accessible data, the ability to measure more accessible data, is better. Now, that means a number of things, right? If you think of the traditional types of data that you collect, whether it's pre-test and post-test, or it's a slightly more evolved pre-test, first and final post-test analysis, whether it's polling that you've introduced into the educational experience, whether it's follow-on surveys that are synced up and coordinated with each learner's individual experience. As Jason explained, whether it's more question-specific data or answer option-specific data, whether it's the type of data that I've been advocating for the past year or 2 around learning actions data, or if it's the type of data that we heard in the first session of the day around performance data. Wherever your data is, it's critical that that data be made accessible. It shouldn't be a Herculean effort that you have to repeatedly take on to go and collect these data points. The secret to Agile educational design is to make your data more accessible, make it less burdensome for the learners, but make sure that your educational planners have that data at their fingertips as rapidly or even in real time, so that there's no burden to collecting that data. So tip number 1 for Agile educational design is make sure that everything you're measuring is being measured in a way that that data is readily at your fingertips. So we'll move on to the second critical element, which is, now that you've got the data at your fingertips, data without analysis isn't beneficial. To me, as someone who now partners with multiple organizations, I'm sure, Scott, as CEO of a medical education company, the idea of putting all these nets out to collect all of this data only to not use it or not use it effectively is a bit of an inefficiency, a lack of productivity. And that's definitely something that we want to avoid. So when you think about the data you're collecting, it's critical that you move from a collection mindset, accessibly structuring that data, to a mindset of analysis and interpretation. What is it that you intended to measure, and what do the various data points inform you to? What are the limitations of your methods? Time and time again, I've seen education groups who bring their data, they collect it, they bring it together, and they initially look at it, and they derive very strong opinions about what their data is telling them, only to realize that they never removed test subjects. They didn't understand the limitations of the multiple choice question design. There were confounding influences. Maybe a learner took the post-test 17 times until they passed it, and all 16 failed attempts are all being counted into their data sets. It's critical that when you have accessible data, that you have the requisite resources and competencies internally to productively analyze that data. Because only when you do that, only when you understand the limitations of your data, and when you have the requisite resources and competencies to analyze that data, only then can you begin to draw your conclusions. And ultimately, in an agile educational design approach, what you're looking for is either concrete causality or hypothesis-generating causality. You're looking for opportunities to say that endpoint may have been due to this interventional attribute, or it may have been due to this design flaw in either our questions or in our educational content. And therefore, that's a pressure point that we may be able to go back to and improve or refine or enhance the learning experience. Okay? So we're going to move to that third critical element before we transition over to Scott. And that third element is you've got your accessible data. It's all structured. It's readily available. It's at your fingertips. And you and your team understand the limitations of your methodology. You understand the resources available so that you know how much energy you can spend in the analysis. And you have the skills to analyze the data. And you have all these great conclusions that you've drawn, some of them that are very fact-based around the causality between cause and effect in your educational plan. But you look at your educational content, or you look at the learning experience, and you come to the recognition that there's nothing you can change. You can't reshoot the video if it's an online educational program. Your faculty members are inflexible in how they approach content in live meetings, or you're working with a third party that would charge you an arm or a leg to go back in and update or improve the educational content, even though you have significant data suggesting that there are just a few minor changes that could be made in the educational content or in the learning experience that'll fundamentally improve the overall impact of your education for scores, hundreds, even thousands of learners that would follow. So what do you do if you realize that change is impossible? And how, maybe proactively, can you approach your educational design so that you can ensure that you have the ability to modify the content, to modify the environment, or to modify the measurements? And with that, keeping those three elements in mind, ready data at your fingertips, the expectation and the ability to analyze that data, and the recognized need to go in and change, adapt the educational content or experience, how can you do this productively and efficiently? And I think, Scott, that should tee you up for some of the examples that you were wanting to share with the community about how your team at MedIQ has approached Agile educational design.
Thanks, Brian. I just want to clarify. Did you say hypothesis causality?
I did, and if that doesn't make sense to you, then that we're on an equal playing field. Clearly, what I meant there is
I Googled it. We're good.
From your standing desk, you Googled that.
So, thanks for teeing me up. I want to share with you. Yes, it's a MedIQ perspective and point of view, but I also try to speak for the rest of the providers in the community. I think that a lot of us are doing have deployed the adaptive strategy here. Maybe not as formal as the as Brian has indicated. I think some of them are more sophisticated and are able to do this, and I think many of us really sort of building this in as we go here, realizing education can't be posted, especially in an online environment, and then left to be obsolete. And so I do think many of us are doing this, but again, to more formalize it, I wanted to take what Brian has said and give you sort of my opinion, and maybe if you can go to the next slide, looking at it from the perspective of what are the drivers of having to refine or change what's taking place in your education. And I look at it from an internal and an external perspective. And I think even before you go down this path, you have to look at it. Many of us have designs that we deploy in education that are fairly rigid. And so the question is, do we have a design that, as Brian pointed out earlier, that will be able to adapt in some way, shape, or form midstream in an educational intervention to accommodate any of these internal or external changes? And if the answer is no, the designs are too rigid, then all of us in the provider side of this equation need to think long and hard about how we can certainly adapt moving forward. The second is, do we have this built into our planning process? And so when our teams are together planning out an educational initiative, or do they have the foresight to look downstream and say, we anticipate new data will be coming out in 4 or 5 months. How will that new data impact the education that we're about to launch? And then we need to accommodate for that, to plan for it, and build a strategy and that will allow us to have to be able to incorporate it. I want to think about, when we look at these drivers, I want to think about it from the learner's perspective, right? Let's go back to the person that's participating in our education. And are we providing them an opportunity for learning that is as relevant and as important to their success the day that we launch it? Is it as important at the end of that initiative? And that's the question you really want to ask yourself. When this intervention, this activity has run its cycle, its 12-month or 18-month cycle, is it still as relevant as it was the day that we launched it? And that's a simple question that we ask ourselves, and I think other providers need to ask themselves. But these drivers I look at from an internal and an external point of view. And so I want to talk about from an external standpoint. I just gave you the quick example of if we're in a dynamic clinical space and we anticipate that there will be new data emerging, how is that going to impact our education? A very, very simple example right now is we launched a lipids activity back in the summer, or I'm sorry, back in the early fall. But we knew that once ACC took place, which it did a few weeks ago, that there was likely to be new data. And we built a design that would accommodate updates from ACC into our online platform. And quite honestly, if we hadn't done that, a lot of what we have in that activity right now might be obsolete. And so these, again, just a practical example of having the foresight to say we anticipate change, we anticipate new data. What ways can we do this? Now, I will share with you, it isn't complex. And so what I don't want the CE provider community to think is that there's this heavy technology play here and that this costs a lot of money. There are very simple, straightforward ways that you can post updates to your activities online. Now, I'm not a technology guy, Brian, obviously, you know better than I do on this, but there are strategies that you can deploy to keep things current, add new content, without necessarily creating an enormous cost implication. The other thing I think you have to look at from an internal standpoint, from an internal standpoint, is the outcomes data that you're gathering from your education. And so midstream of an intervention, and this happens rather frequently, and I'm sure other providers have experienced this. You're looking at your pre-post data and your longitudinal data, and you're seeing that 2 or 3 of the concepts, let's say 1 or 2 of the concepts, your intervention, learners are having a hard time getting their arms around it. The education, the concepts aren't sticking nearly as well as some of the other concepts during that activity. And so you look at the questions that you're asking. You ask, is there a design problem in the questions? And you vet those and you do your due diligence on that. Or is there something in the way that the content was designed that maybe we could have done a better job? And so from an adaptive strategy, you want to be able to stop midstream, ask the hard questions, get your content team together, get your educational design folks together, evaluate the outcomes, consult with faculty, and try to get an understanding also from the learners themselves why they're having trouble with the concept. And once you're able to gather that information, make the change. Maybe it is a refinement of the question. Maybe it is an adaptive strategy where you're adding additional content to reinforce certain points. But using your outcomes data to make that change midstream so that the education is not obsolete and it is as strong as it needs to be. And I'll give you a great example in the QI space right now. As many of us are heading in from an education point of view, participating in quality education activities, there's this opportunity when you're looking at data in real time through electronic medical records, and you're pulling data on a monthly basis. You're able to adapt in real time, very, very different than we have in the past. A case in point is we're doing an activity where we're evaluating screening rates in Hep C in primary care clinics within the Duke Primary Care Network and Virginia Mason, as well as University of North Texas. And we're pulling data on a monthly basis, looking at how primary care practices are getting the concept and what changes that they're making to improve screening rates to align with CDC guidelines. And if we were to do that intervention where we put the education in place and then measure it 6 months and then 12 months, we'd be missing the boat. We're having to adapt every month based on how individual clinics are understanding the concept and are able to deploy in order to make change. And we are having to adapt the education, very customized, high-touch learning format on a monthly basis. And again, this is another strategy, but when you get into the QI space, it's virtually impossible just to develop something and then measure it at the back end. You've got to constantly adapt based on the data you're getting in real time.
So Scott, do you think, I think that's a great point, do you feel like the community is more susceptible to the Agile approach in something like QI, where maybe there's just an easier understanding of performance change is hard to do, so the idea that you're going to plan an intervention that's perfectly going to lead to performance change is unlikely, so I have to be iterative in my QI program, versus in educational design, well, the culture has been for the past 20 years to plan education to a point in time and then send it out. And it is what it is, and it may be effective, it may not. Do you see those as two different, one more easy approach to understand Agile?
So I think the QI or the PI space, I think what we've all realized is that in order to make a performance or quality change, you have to be Agile, because the circumstances that you're dealing with in every system or every clinic or every practice is ultimately going to be very, very different. And in any kind of performance change, it has to be managed, with constant feedback, right? You have to be able to adapt and measure constantly and make changes in real time in order to improve performance. I don't know that we've ever thought about it that way in the non-performance space, in the knowledge and competency space. But to your point, which I think is a good one, is why don't we, right? So why aren't we building models where we're measuring it the same way and being able to react in real time as education providers in order to make those changes to make the education more effective? So I'm in agreement, but I don't think we've ever had to think that way. But I think it's a great opportunity for us to at this point.
And so culturally, the QI is so new to so many in the community that they enter that area without expectation. They don't really know what the way is to do it, so they're kind of learning as they go. Where in education, the cultural expectation was you create an intervention and you put it out there, and then at some point, whenever really there's some external incentive, you go and you measure it, and it's at the end. It's like maybe some of this is just a cultural expectation. Status quo is.
Well, maybe, but I also think that those in the QI space are going to figure out pretty quickly that what they're learning from QI educational design can be applied in the knowledge space. And I will say that there are those in the community that are doing that. They're posting, and it's a rigid design, and it's up, and we'll measure data at the end of the year. But I do think that this is an innovative group. I mean, you got some of the smartest people in healthcare in the CME space right now. And I think there are many people in this industry, in this profession, who are figuring out how to be innovative and build designs that are going to apply some of these principles that we see in the QI space and the knowledge and competency space. Another example for you, though, I think is interesting, is that you take a rigid design like symposia, where it's traditionally been big box symposia, physicians or faculty in the front of the room, 300-400 people in the audience. They deliver a 60-90-minute lecture and it's over. And the idea years ago was, well, let's have the audience start asking questions, and that was considered innovative, and that was great. But what we're seeing right now, and it's not just at MedIQ, but we're seeing other providers starting to get really innovative with this as well, and that is looking at the activity where you're letting the learners essentially in that setting drive the learning. And so some of the techniques that you're seeing from an adaptive learning point of view is that, yes, you have a grant request that you submit, and there are learning objectives, and there is a framework for the agenda for the evening. But the innovators are getting out and they're interviewing attendees to the scientific meeting, and they're asking them, what's keeping you up at night in this clinical area? What are the issues of the day that you're facing? What do you want to know more about? And they're taking those questions and those comments and they're feeding them in real time to the faculty while they're on the podium and to the moderator while they're moderating these sessions. And you're seeing now where there's real-time Q&A now, where faculty are literally pivoting in real time based on what the audience is telling them or the questions that they're being asked. And this, again, is another example of adaptive education where you're letting the learners drive the learning. And that, I think, is a really powerful moment from both the faculty, at least from what we hear from faculty, they're energized by that. They get really, really engaged. And also from the learner's point of view, they feel like they've got a voice or they've got a say in what's taking place in that room. I think the challenge with something like that, obviously, is you've got to have really strong moderators, and you've got to have a really good plan in place from a planning process so that you don't get inundated with questions and in the very, very beginning, and your activity tends to run off the rails. So I think there's some pros and cons to adaptive education strategies, but it does create it is successful if the planning process is a sound planning process.
Brian, can I jump in real quick? I have a question from the audience.
Please.
It's directed at you, but I think either any of you can answer it, and maybe you've already covered it a little bit. But you're suggesting that we update, change content continually, but then how can you look at the outcomes as a whole if the participants viewed different iterations of the content?
Don't. Fundamentally, that's the cultural pitfall, is that you're looking at outcomes as if it is a whole thing. You're looking at an intervention as if it is one thing. And that is a very inefficient use of resources and time and energy. So by breaking it up into smaller pieces, by in an online example, allowing the first 200 or 300 learners and the data that is generated by their experience. Choo-choo!
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's the nicest train car I've ever seen. So by learning from the first 250 learners, now you may have 400 or 1,000 other learners that are going to make their way to that educational intervention in the subsequent 4 or 6 months. From the first 200 learners, you've come to understand better what's working and what's not working. Why would you want those next 600 or 1,000 learners to come through a program that you know could be better, just so you can wait to the next grant cycle a year later and update the content then? Another way to answer that question is, in the CE community, we have constantly challenged ourselves with the lack of control groups and the expense of building control groups, and the reality that most of our outcomes data is answering the question, did something work, but not why did it work or how did it work. If you think in an agile design approach, the experience from the first 250 learners leads to modifications of content and experience, and now you have a different intervention for the next 250 learners, which may inform the next 250 learners. So you can either do it by number of learners, or you can do it by quarterly review, or whatever process is easiest for your organization to operationalize. But the idea of understanding education as a whole, as a 365-day unit, I believe is part of the problem. Now, after I've done my agile design and I basically have version 1, version 1.1, and version 2 of the educational intervention and the content, now as a whole, what I'm looking at is the serial impact that my different changes had on the impact of the different changes had. So what I can say at the end of the day is, Griselda, thank you very much for your grant support. Let me explain not only the impact of my educational intervention, but how modifying content in these small ways led to this change, modifying the experience in these small ways led to this change, and at the end of the day, here's the unmet need that my Agile approach has not yet been able to solve. Now, there's my next needs assessment. So Griselda, if you kind of view it that way, in these small iterative interim analyses, I imagine as a supporter that that's a very different way to understand the impact of your grant dollars.
I definitely agree with that. You know, you guys laid an excellent foundation in terms of explaining what Agile is, and then Scott with the practical examples of how it can be accomplished. I'm a huge proponent for considering a curriculum or an activity, an educational intervention of any kind in the context of the expected learner trajectory. So where were they at the beginning? Where are they now? Where is it that you want them to go? And trying to understand it in the context of how practice is changing, how new guidelines may inform their clinical choices and their clinical decision making overall, and how that will impact your activity. I think I'm really looking to see that you're doing that, and that you're doing it in small ways. I think, you know, Scott made an excellent point in that I expect to see that as a component of every educational activity, and it doesn't have to be extremely complex. But you know, when you talk about PDSA cycles and you think about planning an educational program and how there's not an end to that process necessarily, you're really thinking about working backward, beginning with the end in mind, working backward from what you want to accomplish. And you really have to make all of those elements line up in order for me to be able to read your grant proposal, understand that throughout you're going to be able to make the small adjustments that are necessary, that you've given it forethought and you understand what the expectations are, and that new data may become available. All of those elements combined with your selections and choices in terms of your faculty, your ability to use technology appropriately or partner with the appropriate education partners to help deliver your activity and be able to refine and then be also reflexive and adaptive in that space is something that I actually do look for. And right now it comes up more and more often at the point where I'm talking with folks about final outcomes. But if you approach me with an interim outcomes report and you have enough data that we can begin to look at it and maybe make refinements based on, well, this particular demographic seems to be having more difficulty with this question, or how about the way this question is written? To me, it looks confusing. If it's looking confusing to me and I know and understand that disease state very well, how might it have looked to the practitioner whose particular responsibility is not necessarily related to being the provider of the clinical care for that patient? And being able to make those small adjustments makes a huge difference in terms of my understanding of your ability to execute on a plan and deliver quality outcomes data that I can use internally to have real world discussions about how education is changing patient care. So, you know, that's the trajectory I'm looking for. And then the learner trajectory is something that I advise everyone to keep in mind. You don't want them, their education doesn't end with you. You're just a component of it. And you really need to be setting them up for success with the next intervention they have, whether it's an actual education intervention or a conversation with their colleagues.
So you raise a couple good points there, and in some of our planning conversations between the three of us, one of the things that we had discussed is in some way the reality is that we've seen in grant proposals increasingly over the last few years this language of agile or iterative design, maybe not using those exact words, but certainly that spirit that we're going to go back in and we're going to adapt and we're going to move. And what I find is that this is one of those periods in CE's history where the words are being used maybe before the groups are really ready to execute in that regard. So I'll talk to a group, and they've got the data. They've got number one ticked off. They've got tremendous data. It's readily available in their CMS or in their partners' data export pages. And 6 months will go by. And I can point to a line in a grant proposal that says we're going to do this quarterly review and we're going to look for places to change the content. And 6 months will go by, and I'll reach out to the project manager for that organization, and that person switched positions. That person is no longer on that project because that project launched already. That person's on the next project that's ready to launch. So operationally, the idea that there's got to be ownership of content that persists over time, so that 3 months, 6 months, 9 months after something launches, there's still a continuity around that coordination, that agile effort. Scott, any thoughts internally as someone who runs an organization and you've got these project managers that are assigned in different ways? How do you ensure that there's real continuity there, that on day one after something launched, that the mind space of your team hasn't moved on to the next project, the next urgent deadline?
Everybody's a stakeholder in the process, and so you've got multiple players on any educational initiative team. So you have project management, you have logistics, you have content, you have your compliance, your outcomes folks, audience development, and it's important from a leadership standpoint in your organization to make absolutely certain that everybody on the team is completely aware of, in the planning process, of what needs to take place. And so when you have somebody that leaves the team and goes to another project, you're not necessarily you're not losing anything by that, because everybody else is. It's already built into the design. It's already built into all of the backup and the infrastructure of that activity, so that everybody's a stakeholder, understands and knows what the responsibilities are to make certain that those things continue to take place. That's a planning and leadership. That's more about planning and leadership within an organization than it is actually about the design itself. It's operational systems and processes and checks and balances.
So many who are listening into this may know that Griselda and I were actually a tandem for a while. Griselda, before joining Otsuka, was probably the best project lead that I've ever worked with. So the leadership operations side of things, that's really, Griselda, if I can say, I mean, that's your strongest suit. That's how you kind of made your bones in CE before becoming a supporter. So if you could put that hat back on, what are the operational challenges or hurdles that you could imagine as a project lead, making sure that there is continuity in the hours, days, weeks, and months that follow education, quote unquote, launching?
Well, I think, Scott made some very good points. I think, first of all, everyone has to be invested. They have to understand the goals and objectives of the educational intervention, and that we're going to be holding everybody to the same high standard. We worked with a pretty strong calendar when I was a provider, meaning that we knew at which intervals we had expectations to acquire the data, review the data, analyze it, and make refinements as we went along. But aside from having that calendar, one of the things that we thought was really key was the level of investment of our faculty. So we were constantly feeling like we needed to consult with the faculty and going back to them and saying, hey, we've got this level of data. And we asked for that commitment up front, that they understand that we want to be adaptive to the needs of the learner and also to the data that we're identifying and what we're finding from our analyses. And getting them invested and involved, I think, although the hardest component of driving the improvements to the education, it was the most rewarding when they could see how you could make simple changes, either question wording changes or refinements to some of the graphical elements we were using to explain a particular concept, simplifying some of the information, recognizing that the audience we maybe anticipated and targeted is not exactly the makeup of the audience who's actually participating, and making refinements based on what their roles and responsibilities are for that particular disease state and the level of care they're providing to patients. Those types of things are things that we had to consider. And knowing that that was going to be a component of every educational activity becomes the norm, and it's something that can be done and reinforced, and should be.
So, Derek, do you want to do a call for questions?
Yeah, I mean, I can. We don't have any at this point. I also want to point out, too, you got 5 minutes to go. So
that's perfect. So if you can move to the first summary slide.
Sure.
Derek, I appreciate it.
You want this one or move on?
That's that one.
Okay.
So the conversation started and really was framed by hopefully an understanding of the critical importance of agile design. So there are no perfect activities, and certainly no activities are launched in their optimal form, both in terms of content and intervention. And that leads us to adapt our planning process in ways that are more flexible and more agile. And that's the heart of this session. To do that, to truly summarize what agile educational design is, it's important to remember the 3 critical elements. First is that you need to effectively and strategically measure. The more accessible the data, the better. Number 2 is that you need to be able to analyze that data. Measuring more, having that data be more accessible, is only important if you are prepared to analyze and interpret these data. And then having great data and being able to interpret the data are only really valuable if you look at the 3rd element of agile educational design, which is you have to have the ability to refine and enhance your activities. Scott's done a great job at emphasizing that if you apply rigid design approaches, then the agile educational design model probably isn't going to work for you. It's just going to point out things that you might not be able to change. And that's certainly a point of frustration. I want to end with what I hope to be kind of a striking visual of what this looks like. Historically, over time, we've had a moment in time that we refer to as a launch. It's episodic. Even if there's multiple activities, they're going live on a day, or the meeting is taking place on a day. And then subsequent to that day, whatever the height of impact, the magnitude of impact was, that's going to persist. It's not going to get marginally better. It may actually get worse, as Scott pointed out, as data evolves, as the science evolves. Your content may become increasingly irrelevant. Now, marry that or couple that to what an agile educational design approach looks like. So if you can hit the space button one more time, Derek. Now what you're doing is you're systematically planning iterative analyses and refinement phases. They could be set by the number of learners. So I'm going to have 250 learners, and then the next 250 are going to get a slightly different program. Or they could be set by a calendar. After 90 days, I'm going to make a change, and after 90 days. But with each change that you make, if you're using and analyzing your data effectively, then I think it's logical to assume that the impact on the y-axis is going to improve. And now you move forward over a few weeks or a few months or a few hundred learners, and you make a small change. These can be small changes. A simple tap the learner on the shoulder, a nudge, an emphasis of one area or another area, cleaning up slides, making them less busy, making the visuals more striking, as Griselda pointed out. With each of those phases of adaptation, you get closer and closer to your ultimate SMART goals, those measurable, timely, responsive goals. And that's ultimately what agile educational design is going to ensure. Instead of putting all your eggs in one basket and waiting around for a year to find out whether your eggs cracked or gave birth, agile educational design gives you the ability to constantly update and refine, and that should become the cultural expectation for education, the way it may already be around programs like quality improvement programs. So Griselda, Scott, any last minute thoughts?
I just want to say, something to the provider community because I think it's so important, but also to, other supporters. As new concepts or new nomenclature, and maybe not a new concept, but new nomenclature are introduced, we are really relying very heavily on providers to help educate us about the new things that they're doing or the ways that they're adapting education to drive better quality. And I think that that's so important. So as I sit and I listen to both you and Scott talk about how to create an agile educational intervention, I'm really thinking about what should I be looking for when I'm reviewing a grant, and I think we need to continue this discussion because the education is not just on the part of the provider, it's on the part of those of us who are going to be looking at the grant proposals and really thinking about are they going to be able to deliver on what they say? Does this match my educational strategy? And will this or is this likely to bring the level of value that they say it will if they make these adaptations based on their findings? So just something that I think is important. It's not a one-way conversation between providers. It's a conversation that needs to happen in a dialogue between all stakeholders.
Scott?
No, I think you said it all. Both you and Griselda did, and it was a great session. Thanks for the invite.
Derek, Scott, thank you. Scott Korber, thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to answering any questions offline. You can use the hashtag CMEPalooza. We can connect through Twitter. But thank you very much for taking this hour out of your day to listen to our presentation.
Sure, and thanks all of you for being on it. Let me just close with, please, if you haven't already done so, take our CMEPalooza Spring Survey. It's on the live page. And also for the next session, I'll be coming up here in 3 minutes. Just give it a moment, then you'll just need to refresh your browser, and you'll be all ready to go. We'll start at 1 o'clock. Achieving Level 7 Outcomes, a MEC Perspective. So thanks again, everyone, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.